The woman the emperor loved most, and waited more than 10 years for, ended up wanting to kill him. A young emperor was forced to marry 4 of his own aunts from within the family, and he fell deeply in love with one of them. But the one who ultimately destroyed him was the very woman he loved most. After she was sent out of the palace, the emperor waited for her for more than 10 years. Even when the outside world said she had become a nun, he still could not forget her. After finally taking power into his own hands, he brought her back to the palace at any cost. But what he did not know was that what he had brought back was not a reunion with his old love, but betrayal. This woman, the one he loved most, was gentle and affectionate in front of him, while secretly carrying on an affair with another man and even plotting to have the emperor killed. And when the truth finally reached his ears, his first reaction was not anger, but disbelief. Why and how did this relationship ultimately end? Hi everyone, I'm Jason. This is a different story. Today we're telling the story of Emperor Xiaowen of Northern Wei, Tuoba Hong, and Feng Run, a story of love, betrayal, and revenge that sounds like palace legend, but truly happened. Tuoba Hong was the 7th emperor of Northern Wei. He took the throne at the age of 4, but becoming emperor did not mean he actually held power from childhood. In fact, when he was still very young, the person who truly controlled the fate of the empire was another woman, Empress Dowager Feng, the one who raised him. If you've seen my earlier videos, you probably already know that Empress Dowager Feng was one of the most powerful women in Northern Wei history. Although she was nominally Tuoba Hong's grandmother, in reality they were not related by blood. She had been a consort of Tuoba Hong's grandfather, and through political struggle and shifts in palace power, she gradually came to hold supreme authority over the entire empire. She had no children of her own, and precisely because of that, she understood better than anyone that the power in her hands had to be carried on through her family. So she did something that sounds utterly absurd, yet made perfect sense within the logic of power at the time. She married her older brother's 4 daughters, one after another, to her grandson, Tuoba Hong. In other words, under his grandmother's arrangement, this young emperor ended up marrying 4 of his own aunts. It sounds completely outrageous. But at the time, this was not about love, and it was not about morality. It was a naked political arrangement. Of those 4 women, however, 2 died of illness shortly after entering the palace. The 2 sisters who truly changed the course of the story were the ones who remained, Feng Run and Feng Qing. Compared to her sister, Feng Qing seemed more like the kind of woman suited to a place on the political chessboard. Feng Run, on the other hand, was the one who could make the emperor fall in love for real. Historical records describe Feng Run as exceptionally beautiful, striking, and graceful, with a gentle temperament and elegant bearing. For a young emperor who had been surrounded by power since childhood and had almost no chance to experience normal human affection, it would have been hard not to be drawn to a woman like that. Tuoba Hong fell in love with Feng Run very quickly, and Feng Run, it seems, was not entirely without genuine feelings for him either. At least in the beginning, the 2 of them truly shared a period of mutual affection. Feng Run was deeply favored, and she also often looked after her younger sister Feng Qing in the palace, which won her even more of the emperor's admiration. His preference for her became more and more obvious, to the point that he was already preparing to make her empress. If the story had ended there, it might have become a palace love story. But of course, fate has a way of turning suddenly just when things seem closest to perfect. Just as the emperor was preparing to make Feng Run his empress, she suddenly fell gravely ill. She had been frail and sickly since childhood, and this illness came on fast and hit her hard. Even though the emperor adored her at the time, that was not enough to overcome the palace's cold and superstitious logic. In those days, a woman in the imperial harem who remained seriously ill for too long was often seen as a bad omen. And at the most politically sensitive moment, a sick woman would have had little chance of smoothly rising to the position of empress. So, Empress Dowager Feng made a decision. Feng Run would be sent out of the palace to recover elsewhere. For Tuoba Hong, this was not simply a matter of resting and recuperating. It was a sudden and painful separation, but at that time, he had not yet truly taken power into his own hands, and he had no way to defy Empress Dowager Feng's decision. He could only accept it. Why did Feng Run fall ill at exactly that moment? Later on, this question made many historians suspicious, because looking at what followed, her departure due to illness seemed far too convenient. Almost as soon as Feng Run left the palace, the situation inside the court changed immediately. After Feng Run was sent away, her younger sister Feng Qing immediately began doing everything she could to win the emperor over. But the problem was, the person in the emperor's heart was still Feng Run. Feng Qing quickly realized that she could never truly take her sister's place in his affections, so she shifted her attention to someone even more important, Empress Dowager Feng. And of course, Empress Dowager Feng knew perfectly well that the emperor's true feelings were for Feng Run. But in her eyes, who the emperor loved was not what mattered most. What mattered most was that the position of empress had to remain in the hands of the Feng family. So Empress Dowager Feng forced Tuoba Hong to make Feng Qing his empress, and that is how Feng Qing was formally installed as empress. Although Feng Qing gained the title, she never became the emperor's most beloved woman. Instead, Lady Lin, the emperor's new favorite, grew closer and closer to him. Before long, Lady Lin became pregnant and gave birth to a son. Under normal circumstances, that should have been a tremendous cause for celebration. But in the Northern Wei Palace, that kind of good news concealed an extremely cruel system. Viewers who have seen my earlier videos may remember this custom. In Northern Wei, in order to prevent a young emperor from being controlled by his birth mother's family, the court followed a brutal rule for a long time. Once a child was designated as the heir to the throne, the child's mother had to be put to death. That also explains why Tuoba Hong was raised by Empress Dowager Feng. His biological mother and grandmother were both victims of this system. Even the family behind his birth mother was purged for harsh political reasons. In other words, Tuoba Hong himself was also one of the victims of this system. And because of that, he once asked Empress Dowager Feng to abolish this cruel practice. But she refused. If the woman who had borne the prince had been from the Feng family, there might still have been room to maneuver. But the one who gave birth was Lady Lin. To Empress Dowager Feng, Lady Lin was not one of her own people. On the contrary, because of the prince's existence, she could become a future threat. In the end, Lady Lin was still forced to die. She became yet another woman Tuoba Hong was powerless to protect. Many historians later believed that Feng Run's illness and departure from the palace may not have been caused by health alone. One well-known theory is that Feng Run may also have been pregnant at the time. If that speculation is true, then Empress Dowager Feng sent her out of the palace not simply because she was sick, but more likely to protect a member of the Feng family in advance, so that she would not later be executed for bearing an heir. That way, the Feng family could preserve an important piece on the board without disrupting its overall power arrangement. Of course, this is only a later theory and cannot be fully proven. But regardless of what the full truth may have been, one thing is clear. After Feng Run left the palace, Tuoba Hong never forgot her. On the contrary, he kept thinking about her. He sent many physicians to treat her, hoping she would recover soon. What he never could have imagined was that one of the very men he sent would one day become the fatal thorn that broke him. After leaving the palace, Feng Run was sent to recuperate in a temple. Officially, the royal court announced to the outside world that she had become a nun. That helped prevent rumors and also allowed her to disappear from the palace's view for a time. But outwardly, becoming a nun did not mean she had truly cut herself off from worldly attachments. And she was still very young. She had been taken away from the emperor she loved, from the luxury and future that had once seemed within reach, and placed alone in a temple. For her, this was no longer just about recovering from illness. It was more like being pushed off a cliff by fate at the very moment she had come closest to becoming empress. She did not know whether she would ever be able to return, or whether the emperor would keep waiting for her. When someone is at their most vulnerable, most lonely, and most uncertain about the future, and they happen to meet a person who treats them with kindness, things can begin to change quietly. Among the doctors the emperor sent to treat her was one man named Gao Pusa. He was striking in appearance and carried himself with unusual grace. To Feng Run, trapped in a temple with no clear future ahead of her, Gao Pusa may have felt like a sudden beam of light breaking into the darkness. As the two spent day after day together, their relationship gradually changed. At first, perhaps it was only dependence, only confidences shared in private. But later, that relationship crossed a line. Little by little, Feng Run and Gao Pusa became lovers. Over time, people around them began to notice, and the rumors slowly spread. In order to protect the family's reputation and keep the matter from growing any bigger, the Feng family ordered Gao Pusa to stay away from the temple and forbidden him from seeing Feng Run again. But by then, it was already too late. Feng Run had already fallen deeply in love with him. In the year 490, Empress Dowager Feng died. For the entire Northern Wei court, it marked the end of an era, and for Tuoba Hong, it meant that he could finally begin dealing with things according to his own will, things he had once been unable to touch. After his mourning period ended, one of the first things he did was immediately send people to check on Feng Run. When he learned that she had recovered, he hesitated almost not at all before deciding to bring her back to the palace. This was actually an extremely sensitive move. Publicly, the court had long maintained that Feng Run had become a nun. For a nun to suddenly return to the palace would naturally invite all kinds of gossip and criticism. But Tuoba Hong simply did not care. And so, after being away from the palace for more than 10 years, Feng Run returned once again. And this time, Tuoba Hong treated her even better than before. Even though there were already faint rumors about how her life in the temple had not been entirely clean, and even though those rumors were not without some basis, the emperor still chose to trust her. He doted on her and gave almost all of his affection back to her. But the problem was that Feng Run was no longer the same 14-year-old girl who had entered the palace years before. For Tuoba Hong, this was a reunion, but for Feng Run, it was more like being dragged back into an old cage. The emperor's love for her had not changed, but the man Feng Run truly loved was no longer the emperor. On the surface, she was still gentle, soft-spoken, and understanding. She still knew exactly how to please him. But in her heart, what she truly wanted was not the emperor's love. What she wanted was to one day be with Gao Pusa. And to make that possible, she first had to seize the highest power in the imperial harem. So, from the moment she returned to the palace, things had already begun to change. The older sister, who had once tried so hard to protect Feng Qing in the palace, began to change her face. Feng Run knew very well that her greatest obstacle was her younger sister, Feng Qing, who was already sitting in the position of empress. So she began constantly speaking ill of Feng Qing in front of the emperor. At first, it may have seemed like only small acts of manipulation, but once those whispers are repeated enough, even the strongest impression can begin to shift. At that time, Northern Wei was in a very unusual period. Tuoba Hong was pushing hard for Sinicization reforms, trying to transform the empire from its old Xianbei customs toward Han Chinese systems, clothing, language, and ways of life. It was one of the most important political reforms of his entire life, but Feng Qing still held on to many old habits, especially her refusal to switch to Han-style dress. By itself, that might not have been enough to cost her the position of Empress. But under Feng Run's repeated suggestions, manipulation, and quiet pressure, Feng Qing's resistance to reform gradually became a major reason for her fall from favor. In the end, under Feng Run's relentless push, Tuoba Hong deposed Feng Qing as Empress, and Feng Run finally took the throne as Empress herself. Even more cruelly, she did not just take her sister's title, she also forced her sister into a temple to become a nun. It was almost like fate completing a circle. The suffering that had once fallen on Feng Run, being sent away to a temple, had now been passed on to her own sister. After becoming Empress, Feng Run's power reached its peak, but power itself was not enough for her. The one person she still could not let go of was Gao Pusa, and once again, fate handed her an opportunity. At the time, Northern Wei was constantly at war. The empire launched one campaign after another, and Tuoba Hong personally led troops out of the capital many times, sometimes for months at a time, even as long as half a year. For Feng Run, this became the perfect chance to rekindle her relationship with Gao Pusa. So she came up with an extremely bold and extremely dangerous plan. She had Gao Pusa disguise himself as a eunuch and slip into the inner palace to meet her in secret. After the two were reunited, they poured out all the longing they had carried through the years apart, and before long, they resumed their affair. As time passed, they grew more and more reckless. Between 494 and 499, Northern Wei launched 3 major military campaigns. Tuoba Hong repeatedly led troops in person and spent long stretches away from the palace. And during that time, the relationship between Feng Run and Gao Pusa became increasingly blatant. They were no longer just meeting in secret. It escalated to the point that they openly shared a bed and lived together almost like a real married couple. Many of the palace servants, maids, and attendants knew that the Empress had a lover. The irony was that nearly everyone in the palace knew, except the Emperor himself. Eventually, word even reached Tuoba Hong's ears. But Tuoba Hong simply refused to believe it. In his heart, Feng Run was not just anyone. She was the woman he had loved most in his youth, the old love he had waited for over many years and gone to great lengths to bring back to the palace. She had waited for him for more than 10 years. How could she not endure just a few months of loneliness? He would rather believe it was all rumor than accept that Feng Run had truly betrayed him. And so, while the emperor refused to face the truth, Feng Run and Gao Pusa continued living inside the palace with almost no restraint at all. As Empress, Feng Run used her rank, the power in her hands, and increasingly ruthless methods of control to keep the entire inner palace under tight repression. Anyone who knew the truth either did not dare speak or did not dare stay alive long enough to speak. That was how the secret remained buried until an accident tore it wide open. That accident came from the emperor's own sister, Princess Peng Cheng. During one of the emperor's military campaigns, Feng Run's younger brother, Feng Su, set his sights on Princess Peng Cheng. Feng Run, relying on her own power, also tried to force the princess to marry him. But the problem was that Princess Peng Cheng had only recently lost her husband and had no desire to marry again. Feng Run did not care what she wanted. After the princess refused, Feng Run began humiliating her in every possible way, to the point that Princess Peng Cheng came to believe that if she remained in the palace any longer, sooner or later, Feng Run would drive her into ruin, or even have her killed in secret. In the end, Princess Peng Cheng made an extremely dangerous decision. She fled the city overnight and went to the front lines to find her imperial brother. And as soon as the princess escaped, Feng Run quickly realized that things might be slipping out of control. If the princess told the emperor everything that had been happening in the palace, then her secret with Gao Pusa could be completely exposed. At that point, Feng Run did not choose to stop. Instead, she took an even more desperate step. Together with Gao Pusa, she brought in sorcerers and tried to use witchcraft to curse the emperor and hasten his death. When Princess Pengcheng finally reached the front and told Tuoba Hong everything, the emperor's first reaction was not immediate fury, but doubt and refusal to believe her. He even said to his sister, "How could something like this possibly be true? Are you making all of this up to slander the empress just because you do not want to marry Feng Su?" That tells you something important. Even at that moment, Tuoba Hong was still instinctively trying to protect Feng Run. Princess Pengcheng then gave him the names of everyone involved, explained exactly what had happened, and laid out all the details one by one. Only then did Tuoba Hong finally begin to realize that this might actually be true. Once he realized how serious the situation was, Tuoba Hong immediately ordered the matter sealed off, had the people involved secretly arrested, and prepared for a full investigation. Then, despite already being ill himself, he personally led his forces back to the palace. On the way, he probably still held on to one last shred of hope. Maybe it was not as serious as it sounded. Maybe the rumors had been exaggerated. Maybe Feng Run still had some explanation to give him. But when he returned to the palace and personally interrogated Gao Pusa, every illusion shattered. Gao Pusa confessed almost everything: how he had carried on an affair with the empress inside the palace over the years, how he had entered the inner court, how he had lived with Feng Run, and how they had tried to curse the emperor to an early death. Layer by layer, the truth was peeled back, and Tuoba Hong was finally forced to face the cruelest reality of all. The woman he loved most had truly betrayed him. Not only had she betrayed him, she may even have wanted him dead. When Tuoba Hong learned the truth, he was so overwhelmed with rage and shock that he coughed up blood, and from that point on, he never recovered. And yet, even then, Tuoba Hong could not bring himself to depose Feng Run immediately. He did not strip her of the title of empress right away. He did not have her executed on the spot. Instead, he made just one choice. He would never see her again. And in a way, that decision feels even more devastating. Not seeing her again was less a political punishment than the final collapse of a love that had completely broken apart. Less than 2 months after learning the truth, this emperor, one of the most famous reformers in Chinese history, deteriorated rapidly and died at just 33 years old. But the story did not end there. Because before his death, Tuoba Hong left behind a final edict, and that edict may have been the most complicated, the most restrained, and the most cruel form of revenge an emperor could leave to this woman at the end of his life. He ordered that Feng Run be buried with him, but not in the same tomb. And so, after the emperor's death, Feng Run's life was ended with a cup of poison. And now that the story is over, I want to know what you think about the relationship between Feng Run and Tuoba Hong. Do you think Feng Run was ambitious and ruthless from the very beginning? Or do you think she may once have truly loved Tuoba Hong and only became who she later was through years of separation, the pull of power, and the relentless force of fate? And that final edict Tuoba Hong left behind is especially haunting. He ordered her to be buried with him, yet forbade her from being buried beside him. Do you see that as an emperor's final act of revenge? Or as a man, at the end of his life, who, no matter how deeply he hated her, still could not truly let her go? Who do you sympathize with more in this story? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you were Tuoba Hong, would you forgive her? I'm Jason. See you in the next story.